Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of videos looking at the key institutional actors in American foreign policy. This video covers the role of Congress in foreign policy decision making. Other videos in the series are going to look at the presidency and the bureaucracy. So over the 20th century, congressional power over foreign policy has generally waned in favor of an increasingly powerful presidency. But the U.S. Constitution provides Congress with a number of powers over foreign policy decision making. Article 2 outlines the foreign policy powers of the president. These include overseeing the military as commander-in-chief, negotiating treaties, sending and receiving foreign ambassadors, and executing laws of the country. By contrast, Article 1 outlines the foreign policy powers of the Congress. These include the ability to raise taxes and revenue in order to provide for the general welfare and common defense, the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. This is usually referred to as the Commerce Clause, the power to declare war or to raise armies and navies. The Congress, or more specifically the Senate, has the power of advice and consent. The Senate must be consulted on and approve treaties signed by the president and must approve most presidential appointments, including ambassadors, federal judges and justices, cabinet secretaries, and military officers. Congress also has the power to raise revenue and spend money, and the power to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This clause is usually referred to as the Necessary and Proper Clause, or sometimes the Elastic Clause, and along with the Commerce Clause is the primary source of congressional authority today. On balance, the Constitution seems to establish a broad level of equity between the two branches, and yet, over the 20th century, the foreign policy role of the Congress has generally declined. Why? Part of the relatively weak position of Congress can be explained by a number of Supreme Court decisions that have strengthened the president's foreign policy powers. In U.S. v. Curtiss Wright Export Corporation of 1936, the Supreme Court ruled in a 7-1 decision that the president was the nation's sole organ in international relations. The court concluded that the president's role as commander-in-chief and chief executive vested the office with implicit authority over foreign policy, which far exceeded the powers afforded in domestic politics. This decision set the stage for a broad interpretation of executive powers that would follow. In the Youngstown Steel case, the court established a three-tiered hierarchy for understanding presidential power in foreign policy. According to the concurring opinion issued by Justice Robert Jackson, an opinion regularly cited by the court in future decisions, presidential power is greatest when acting pursuant to congressional authorization, and most restricted, that is, limited to only those powers explicitly articulated in the Constitution when operating in opposition to Congress. But in between those two extremes, there's a zone of twilight, and within this zone, the courts have generally deferred to the executive. The court's deference to the executive in matters of foreign policy has been even more pronounced during times of national emergency or war. In the Korematsu decision in 1944, the court ruled that the exclusion and detention of Japanese Americans in internment camps without formal charge or trial and for the duration of World War II was legally permissible and did not violate their civil or political rights. And more recently, in the Zavotsky versus Kerry case, the court ruled that the president had the sole and executive power to recognize or not recognize foreign nations. In Trump v. Hawaii, the courts ruled that the president had broad authority to unilaterally prohibit immigration from 7 Muslim-majority countries. Collectively, all of these point to a court which is generally supportive of assertions of executive power in the area of foreign policy. And Congress itself often defers to the presidency, particularly during periods of crisis, weakening its own role in the foreign policy process. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. I say allegedly because there's now considerable debate about the authenticity of the reported attacks. While the Maddox escaped unharmed, the incident was used to mobilize congressional support for war, culminating in the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which, without formally declaring war, authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, and to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist allies in Southeast Asia. The broad congressional authorization ultimately led to American involvement in the Vietnam War, a war that would last nearly 20 years and cost millions of lives and billions of dollars on both sides. Similarly, 1 week after the September 11th terror attack of 2001, Congress passed a joint authorization for the use of military force. Again, the terms of the resolution were incredibly broad, authorizing the use of all necessary and appropriate force against anyone deemed to have planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, or harbored anyone who did. The authorization led to the deployment of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, a war that would last more than 20 years and again would cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars. It would also be used to justify combat operations across the Middle East and North Africa, and to justify a host of other programs, including warrantless surveillance, indefinite detention of terrorist suspects and enemy combatants, drone strikes, and a host of other efforts. But even in periods of general deference, and especially after them, Congress often reasserts its authority. It has a couple of tools to do this. First, Congress will often hold hearings, exercising its oversight function as a way of drawing attention to particular issues or to criticize initiatives of the executive. This is particularly the case when Congress and the White House are controlled by different parties. A number of congressional committees can exercise this function. In the area of foreign policy, the job most often falls to the Armed Services, Foreign Affairs, and Homeland Security committees in the House, and to the Armed Services, Foreign Relations, and Homeland Security and Government Affairs committees in the Senate. In addition, the Congress has sometimes authorized special committees to investigate particular matters. And again, there are a number of examples of these, but among the more prominent are a Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, referred to as the Truman Committee, which investigated corruption and cost overruns in the defense budget and military procurement procedures. The Church Committee hearings in the 1970s uncovered privacy and civil rights abuses committed by the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and the National Security Agency, including the MKUltra program, which involved drugging and torturing unwitting Americans as part of an experiment into mind control drugs, and the COINTELPRO surveillance of a number of civil rights and anti-war groups. After the Church Committee findings were released, a number of efforts to limit the scope and autonomy of the intelligence community were undertaken, including an executive order prohibiting assassination of political leaders by American intelligence agents and the establishment of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance, or FISA, courts. Another example was the House Select Committee on the Iran-Contra scandal, established in 1987 to investigate a covert program implemented by the Reagan administration to sell weapons to Iran in order to finance covert operations in Nicaragua, all in violation of congressional legislation, and the House Select Committee on Benghazi, which was established to investigate the attacks on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi, Libya in 2012. In recent years, congressional oversight has been hampered by increasing partisanship and assertions of executive privilege. The Benghazi hearings are a good example of the former, with Democrats contending that the committee's hearings were nothing more than a Republican effort to discredit Hillary Clinton ahead of her run for the presidency. That committee held hearings over more than 2.5 years and ultimately wound up issuing two separate reports. The Republican report found no wrongdoing on the part of Clinton, but did criticize the Defense Department, the CIA, and the State Department for security lapses. The Democratic report accused the committee chair of flagrant political bias while arguing that the investigation was a waste of taxpayer money trying to damage Clinton. And, according to Congress, broad assertions of executive privilege have also undermined congressional oversight efforts. Put simply, the courts have ruled that the president is entitled to frank and honest input from their advisors, and that compelling the release of that information to Congress or the public might undermine the effectiveness of the presidency. Thus, the president will often assert the right to prevent information from being released or from advisors to testify to Congress. The scope of executive privilege and the number of times it's been asserted has increased over time, undermining Congress's oversight efforts. Congress can also use its control over the federal budget to try to influence policy. This is often referred to as the power of the purse, and again, there are multiple examples of this. Throughout much of the Obama administration, congressional Republicans used their control over the federal budget to prevent him from closing the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. They accomplished this by passing a rider to the annual National Defense Authorization Act that prohibited any funds from being spent to transfer prisoners out of Guantanamo Bay. Similarly, in 2019, congressional Democrats passed an amendment to an existing appropriations bill that prohibited federal funds from being used to pay for the southern border wall. President Trump responded by declaring a national emergency and attempting to shift funds from other defense programs to pay for the wall's construction, a move that congressional Democrats attempted to block in the courts. The case was not resolved before the 2020 election, and the Supreme Court ultimately canceled the hearings on the case after President Biden took office. Congress can even use this power to influence ongoing military conflict, though it tends to exercise this power rarely and with great caution for fear of appearing to not support the troops. That said, Congress has used its control of the purse to limit combat operations in Vietnam in the 1970s, in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and in Somalia in the 1990s. And Congress can also use its power of the purse to direct military spending in particular ways. Sometimes this reflects a sense of national security priorities, but other times it's an effort to secure federal spending that benefits members of Congress's home districts. Again, there's lots of relevant examples here, but two recent ones include a 2015 decision by the Congress to expand procurement of the M1 Abrams battle tanks, despite multiple Army generals testifying before Congress that they already have too many tanks and do not want any more as they're not well suited for current operational needs. Similarly, in 2010, Congress authorized $450 million to secure backup engines for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, despite consistent opposition to the program by both Presidents Bush and Obama, and testimony by the U.S. military leadership that the engines were a wasteful, duplicative, and unnecessary effort. Finally, Congress can use its power to create, eliminate, or restructure existing executive branch agencies, a power that it's often used after major conflicts or crises, including passing the 1947 National Security Act, which created the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, and creating the Department of Homeland Security and elevating the role of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence after the September 11th attacks. Congress, or more accurately the U.S. Senate, can also use its power of advice and consent to influence foreign policy. Remember that presidential appointments and treaties must be ratified by a vote of the Senate. All told, the Senate has ratified more than 1,600 international treaties, but it's refused to ratify or even to consider others, and often the power to refuse to ratify a treaty is more important. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, preventing the United States from joining the League of Nations after World War I and effectively dooming that organization to failure. More recently, in 2012, a coalition of Republican senators successfully blocked ratification of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, creating a strange situation where the U.S. recognizes the convention as customary law and even works to enforce provisions of the convention through naval exercises, but is not formally a member of the convention itself. And even more recently, the Senate has blocked ratification of a number of environmental protection measures, including both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Accords. Because ratification of a treaty requires a two-thirds vote of the Senate, it's relatively easy for a small group of senators to block approval. To prevent this, the Congress sometimes grants the president fast-track authority to negotiate new international agreements. Under fast-track authority, Congress grants the president broad discretion to negotiate an agreement, which can then be approved by a simple majority in Congress. Fast-track authority has regularly been used to negotiate international trade agreements, including trade agreements with Chile, Singapore, Australia, Peru, South Korea, Panama, and numerous others. The authority was also used to approve the North American Free Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization agreements. That said, the president can also bypass Congress altogether by signing executive agreements with other countries. Executive agreements carry the force of treaties, but can be easily overturned by future presidents through their own executive orders or agreements. The Iranian nuclear deal reached by President Obama to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions was an example of an executive agreement, and one that President Trump easily overturned when he was elected. Nevertheless, executive agreements have become far more prevalent than formal treaties, particularly in the post-World War II era, primarily to the difficulty of getting treaties through the ratification process. Finally, Congress will sometimes stand up directly to the president in an area of foreign policy. The best-known example of this was the War Powers Act passed over President Nixon's veto after the Vietnam War. We considered the War Powers Act in a separate video, but there's lots of other examples as well. Congress revised the Patriot Act in 2015 in the face of opposition from the executive branch in order to impose new limits and restrictions on surveillance operations against American citizens within the United States. In 2000, the Congress passed the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, which limited claims of sovereign immunity and permitted individuals to sue foreign governments for injuries, deaths, or damages resulting from acts of terrorism. The bill was passed over President Obama's veto. The immediate and practical effect, and the reason for Obama's veto, was that it allowed the families of the victims of the September 11th terrorist attacks to sue the Saudi government for its alleged role in the attacks. And finally, Congress passed legislation which limited President Trump's ability to remove the sanctions imposed on Russia for its interference in the 2016 presidential elections. The legislation was passed by a veto-proof majority and effectively tied the administration's hands by requiring congressional approval for any reduction in Russian sanctions. So that concludes our brief overview of the role of Congress in the foreign policy process. I hope you found it useful, and thanks for watching.